Okay. See lots of familiar names and faces, which is exciting. Thank you all for being here. First one. This is the first time that I have been on the other side of the microphone, so to speak. So I'm excited to do this today. And I think we've been good on the 2 minutes. I'll just keep watching their participants and make sure they get added in as we go. But good afternoon and welcome everybody to the first conversation in the Do Something series presented by Empower Me Center for Housing Innovation. We started this series because neuro-inclusive housing is a very complex issue to try and solve. It is riddled with bureaucratic and broken systems, underfunded, families that are facing real burnout, deals with real human depth and emotion. And as we look to dive in and solve it, we wanted to find and look for the doers. Who are other leaders dealing with other complex systems that are getting things done and rolling up their sleeves? So we're excited to have Kris Wilson as our first guest. I'm going to ask Kris a series of questions, and then at the end, we hope to have time for your questions, and we'll do that. You can put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat. Um, Super excited to have you all here. Kris is the General Counsel and PRI Pipeline Director for Venn Foundation. So we're going to talk today about program-related investments, what they are, how they can be used, and how Venn is on a mission to make sure that this form of capital gets deployed and utilized in as many places as possible. And Kris is a fellow Midwesterner, and he also has a personal connection to our work at Empower Me Living and Empower Me Center. But I'm going to let him take it away. Kris, welcome. Thank you for agreeing to be the first guest. That's a great way to kick it off. And I want you to tell us a little bit more about your personal background and what got you into PRIs and the aha moment when you realized the what PRIs can do and how powerful they are.
Sure. Thanks, Emily. And yeah, it's great that you're hosting these conversations. I had when we first met to learn kind of about the work that you were doing, as you mentioned, it resonated deeply with me. I'm one of seven siblings, so there are a lot of us, and one of my sisters that has some unique features that kind of present some challenges. And the stats that you were sharing about the housing options and the need to do something about that really just sort of knocked me out of my chair a little bit. Just hadn't necessarily thought about it. So it's great to have people thinking and then taking those thoughts into action and doing something with them. And so and as it relates to program-related investments, in my aha moment came several years ago when I was working with someone local in Boston. His name was Jack Connors Jr. He was incredibly thoughtful philanthropist and community leader. He sadly passed away a couple of years ago, but he still holds like an incredible influence and a role model for me on just how to think big, make larger swings to solve tough issues. And so I was trying as a lawyer to take some of his ideas and figure out if there were a way to put them into action. And so I took to the tax code, and as one does, and learned about program-related investments in the code, and that quickly rose as an obvious answer because they allowed funders to address kind of a fundamental barrier to a lot of challenges, which is just access to affordable capital right now. And so whether you're looking at conventional capital that maybe is unaffordable, or you're looking at kind of grant budgets that come over time. Both of those have gaps for big projects that take a lot of a lot of resources immediately, and waiting on those resources, can cause deferred maintenance or increase carrying costs for the capital. So there's just a lot of just um, fundamental increases that are being subsidized by the nonprofit or by the doers as they wait to get to the final amount that they need to actually take the action that they're doing. And so in learning about PRIs, especially in the context of this project, we were looking at a redevelopment, a public-private partnership. There was, city budget that was available, but that happens over time. And so if they were going to pay for it, we get a little bit into the budget every year for 10 years, right? And so the issue with that is the work and the possible outcomes of this development, were immediate for the people who needed it, right? So you can, so waiting 10 years, on paper, fine. We'll just wait, we'll raise the money, but all of the people who need those services need them now. And so how do you get them now? And so the PRI, one of the solutions that we were contemplating was, hey, what if we do a bridge loan? We know the money can be allocated through the city and other resources. Let's do a low-cost bridge loan, get shovels in the ground now, and have it paid off over that 10-year period whenever it gets allocated. That project didn't pan out for other reasons, but that really was just an influential time to realize, hey, if we just what we need to do is is buy time. We don't have to give away the money entirely. It can recycle back to us, but the money needs to be moved now. It can't be moved, even if it's free money through a grant. It can't, if it's moving, on a year by year basis, you're not having the same impact. And so that idea of moving money now, figuring out ways to get larger dollars out the door in a sustainable way that meets the interests of the enterprise or the project, and meets the goals of the funder, was really, really motivating for me.
Wow. Well, first of all, we are grateful to you for really doing something by diving into the tax code. I don't know how many people will say that with the gusto that you did, but thankfully you did unlock this tool. And I think you hit on something that I had spent 10 years of my career in real estate, and one of my bosses would always say to me, time kills deals. And that is very true. And some of these subsidies, you know, they don't consider that every day that you are not moving dirt is more cost. So it's really interesting to hear you come up with this solution. I think that's what's so elegant about PRIs is that they can be structured in all kinds of ways. It's brilliant. You knew the money was going to come over 10 years in the form of this subsidy, but you cannot build a project over 10 years. That is just no. Um, Talk to me about before you dove into the tax code to really understand this, what were some of your beliefs about capital and how it should work? And then once you had your aha moment, how did that change your beliefs?
Yeah, yeah. So I think in addition to reading the tax code, I like to read a lot of books, and one book that I would recommend to everyone is called A New Era of Philanthropy. We can drop that in the chat, but it talks about this idea of Andrew Carnegie is kind of the founder of capitalism and the founder of philanthropy, and being able to do both. And I think, whether over time those principles have stuck, whether through a lack of creativity or, laziness, and I'm speaking, personally as well. You just think that business, makes the money, philanthropy gives the money away. And, it's easy to conceptualize, it's simple, and that's the end of that, right? And so
I muted you, user error, trying to.
no
And
worries. I think I'm back.
first time as the host, usually. I know Mark Kendall is probably cringing on his side.
It's
All
okay.
right.
It makes it
Thank
makes
you
it
for joining us.
personable, right?
Yes,
So
it does.
Who can't
So
relate to a Zoom malfunction? But the idea of, business doing, making the money, shareholder primacy, maximize profits over here, and after you maximize profits, you can give them away over there through your, philanthropic endeavors. And so I think that framing is just one that is kind of a default, and learning about BRIs and kind of thinking through that project really, shook me out of that just sort of, status quo um, setting to really think more creatively about both sides of that equation. Program related investments, the program related side, we often think of grants, investments, we often think of maximizing returns. But if you can bring the two together, you can move projects forward in a way that is very impactful. And the nice thing about program related investments is they can be in nonprofits. So a nonprofit that has a revenue generating feature or even a cost saving investment, right? I like to think of, solar panels, for example. If you have enough money to install solar panels and enough time, it'll pay for itself, so it's good for the company, good for the climate. But you have to have that initial upfront capital, right? Other forms of equipment, if you're used to leasing equipment, if you could just buy it, great. But people aren't donating for you to buy a new piece of equipment. People are donating for you to, do the work with the equipment. So even if some of your philanthropic capital is going to pay the lease, it's easier to conceptualize. And so in the for-profit landscape, in the nonprofit landscape, there are plenty of great uses for PRIs. And even more compelling is in the for-profit arena, you have, social enterprises that are popping up, whether it's Empower Me Living's mission around putting, more sustainable housing solutions together for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or super innovative, climate or education or how other housing opportunities. These are for-profit companies that have decided, hey, our focus, whether they're a B Corp or alternatively owned or co-ops or just for-profit that's trying to accomplish something under a conventional model, like they have a mission around what they're trying to do. And so if you can take the philanthropic capital and say, hey, we understand that it might take a little bit longer to do that, or the returns might be a little bit less if you're doing that. We'll provide you a loan or an investment that's going to kind of honor those really great mission objectives that you have, and not deter you from them or distract you from them, or place arbitrary financial metrics around your ability to do the business. And so being able to bring in philanthropic capital, we've heard from a lot of, like, especially for-profit social enterprises that said, hey, people have come to us and they want to invest in us because they think our tech is great or our processes are great. And if we just shifted this way, we could be a lot more profitable. And I'm not saying profit is bad, but for these companies that want to really accomplish that mission, having capital that's going to distract them from that is detrimental. And so bringing in charitable capital that says, hey, if you accomplish what you're trying to do, you take these big swings and you solve what you're trying to solve, we'll be in for the long haul with you, and we'll be patient and provide the terms that actually move forward the mission instead of distract from it. And so I think the reframing around kind of the use of capital is again kind of tied to the tax regs, which is that a definition of a PRI is that the primary purpose cannot be the production of income or the appreciation of assets. Doesn't mean that you can't make money. Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, is a huge example of just a PRI that made a ton of money. Gates Foundation has invested in BioNTech, made hundreds of millions on that investment, right? So you can take your capital, put it in a for profit, and say, hey, we want you to focus on helping to solve this, cure this rare disease, or helping to create access for something that is otherwise inaccessible. And maybe that company is making a bunch of money elsewhere too, but because of the capital that you've given them, they can focus, at least a portion on, that mission that they're trying to accomplish.
thank you for that. I really appreciate, and my beliefs, similar to yours, have changed with this idea of, we live in this binary, just like you articulated. You make the money over here and you do the good, and whatever the market can't solve, nonprofits and the government will solve. And the reality is that's just not it's not that neat. It doesn't work that way, especially for some of these larger, more complex issues like neuro-inclusive housing, homelessness, climate change. It's not a binary. And I've come to these realizations too, and there has to be a different way. There has to be a more what can we use with what we have, and program related investments. They are well within the tax code. Tell us a little bit more for those of us who have not read the tax code. Tell us a little bit more about program related investments in plain English, the PRI 101, and how they are different from a traditional grant and a traditional equity type of investment.
Sure. Yeah. So I think I'll try to share some quick visuals. See if it's my turn to drop the ball on tech. So
Okay, let me make sure that you can share.
here we go. Can you see that?
Yep. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So whenever I think about kind of I think an important framing around program related investments kind of relates to sort of how charitable capital is managed as sort of the status quo. And this image I particularly like because it not only represents the fact that hey, we actually do have quite a bit of money. So $1.74 trillion dollars, as of a Federal Reserve report from I think it was last year. $320 billion dollars that are in donor advised funds, so that there is money that exists, right? But the way that kind of the tax code sets it up, especially in private foundations, is that you have a requirement to give 5%. And so, most, private foundations, some of them kind of work towards that five, some of them go above it. But, the reality is that that 5% sort of frames a lot of the giving. And so the, just vast difference between, the $91 billion dollars that's kind of available for grants and that's kind of operating budget and grants. So that just has to be spent, not necessarily given to a third party nonprofit. So that's like kind of a baby silo on the one side, and then 95%, $1.74 trillion dollars of invested capital on the other side. And whenever you think of program-related investments, people will often ask, is a program-related investment done instead of a grant? So we're just dipping into this 91.6 billion, and instead of giving it away, we're investing it. I don't. You could do that. Nothing prohibits it, but I think the power of program-related investments is that you can start scooping more money out of the 95%. Um, and so if you're looking at invested capital, that's traditionally invested in, just regular markets, some private equity, you're making the most money that you can. And again, all of this trillions of dollars this has already been donated. So this is, post donation capital that's just been growing, virtually tax free inside of these buckets. And so I like this slide because on the one side, whenever you're over in the 5%, you have your program officers who are focused on impact and they're doing really great work. Their job, their task, their role is, get this 5% out the door and accomplish the missions and the objectives that we're trying to accomplish. And they're doing a fabulous job at that. On the other side of the house, in the 95%, you have the investors who are tasked with invest this money, make as much as you can, and in doing so, we'll be able to kind of keep giving away 5%. But whenever you give people roles and behaviors, roles, it sort of shapes the behavior, right? So if you're sitting on one side of the house, you're just focusing on maximizing the returns. If you're sitting on the other house, you're just focused on giving it away, making the impact happen. And so in simple terms, program-related investments bring those two together. And so if we can just get even, a portion, another 5%, that's another $91 billion that becomes available. And you can You still get the money back, so it recycles back. It can have a return. It can offset it. And so whenever you're making an investment that is for good, is driving, some of those efficiencies or impacts and returns back to you, then it helps to justify that 95% that's already been donated, right? And so you're taking the 95% and it can go as a loan, as a investment, as a guarantee. So it can be formed in any of the traditional investment vehicles that exist. But the primary purpose of it is to accomplish accomplish the charitable purpose. And so we think of kind of to your other point, we think of grants over here, impact, no returns out the door, market rate investments, returns, usually no impact, and never shall the two meet. But in the middle, there are kind of a slew of things that can occur. So recoverable grants, are a great tool, especially if you know that if there's a kind of an uncertain event or return. So we were looking at a recoverable grant, during the government shutdown, for example, for service members who weren't getting paid. The government, would eventually open. A lot of these junior members, would be able to get their back pay. But in the meantime, they have bills, they have families, they have all this stuff. So recoverable grant is great. You're not necessarily looking for a return. You just want the money to go out and it'll come back in. You can take a bigger swing, and trust on that. Mission related investments are on the other side. So if you think of like Patagonia or uh what's it called? Bonos, the socks
Yeah.
brands.
Nobos, yeah. Or
Yeah.
Bahamas.
And so I'm not promoting any of these these brands, but generally social enterprises that are like a little more social. They have ESG metrics in place. They have good hiring practices. They have good sustainability practices. Maybe they're moving forward a mission, but they're still primarily structured to make a profit. And so you can kind of move, away from market rate investments and be intentional, kind of do no harm on the mission related investments. Program related investments, what we love about them is it's like a great balance of impact and returns. So you get the primary purpose is the impact. So you're really structuring, you're building everything around that program related investment to further the charitable purpose. But you're using the tools of the market in order to make it happen. And um, so I think understanding, whether you're someone seeking capital or someone who's giving it away, the different tools that are in the toolbox in order to make it happen is far more than just market rates and grants.
That's really helpful, Kris. You hit on something that I want to pull out. Number one, I love that silo illustration because it shows how closed off it is. But here's the thing that I want to call everyone's attention to. That 95% that was sitting in the big silo, that 1.74 trillion, that has already been pledged to be given away. Is that right? Like, so in other words, for all intents and purposes, that money is supposed to quote unquote be set aside for charitable purposes. Why do you think then, and help us unpack and understand maybe, and if this is the case, why then have foundations, if that money is already supposed to be committed to be given away, why do you think grants have just been kind of the de facto response?
Yeah. And so I think there are several reasons for that. And I'm going to post in the chat a very recent report from Social Finance Institute that studied foundations who are using PRIs as well as kind of some of the reasons why foundations don't. And the thing I love about this report is that it relies on an alliterative list. So three C's: congruity, complexity, and capacity. And so the idea, the thread that they pulled in that report was, when you're giving away grants, especially from a tax code standpoint, if you're sending money to a 501(c)(3), that is very straightforward. And so there's really no complexity that's involved in that. You make sure that they're properly registered and doing the things that they're doing, and you send it out the door. You can add complexity if you want to put restrictions in place. But from a bare minimum standpoint, you can do that. It's clean. It's understood. When you start getting into program related investments, they can be a little more complex for two reasons. First reason is that, especially if you just have an investment vehicle, right? Like whether it's a loan, equity, you can have safes, you can have guarantees, you can have all these like, finance tools that the industry has to offer. And so now all of a sudden you have to understand what that is. And so if you're doing a direct investment into a startup, if you're making a loan to someone, that requires just a layer of paperwork in order to accomplish it, right? Paperwork requires people or outside consultants. Um, and then the other side of it is if you're especially if you're giving to for profits, there's something called expenditure responsibility, which is just reporting. So that money, can this company take the funds that I'm giving them? Can they do the specific thing that is being asked of them? And can they report back on how the money is being used? And so those two things just, they're not necessarily overly difficult to do, but they add a layer of complexity. And with complexity comes, the need for, more people, more understanding. You have really great program officers who understand the world of housing or education or all these things, but they're not necessarily trained in how to write a subordinated loan agreement or negotiate a simple agreement for future equity. So you necessarily would need to expand capacity in order to do that. And the last thing is just buy-in. Philanthropists kind of set up for different reasons. Some of them, in some scenarios too, like PRIs might not make sense if you set up a private foundation in order to support a museum, then or a particular area that's just really purely philanthropic, you're not necessarily going to need as much investment. Now, there are scenarios in which they can still happen. But like, it's an endowment that's really created to be in perpetuity to kick out money to support the operating budget of a thing. And so for those organizations, it might not make sense. For other organizations, maybe you're looking at kind of the number that you've given away each year, and it's a much better headline to say that we've given away, $10 million dollars instead of we loaned money, at $10 million. Dollars. So there needs to be buy-in to kind of understand how both of those can have, equal impact. And so, a lot of it is just messaging and telling the story, like how does this like fit into our strategy? And then some of it is just how do you get people to be able to do it? And different buckets of charitable capital. Again, the silo-shaped behavior. So if you're looking at traditional investing and that's the only person you have in-house, they're going to be thinking returns, prudence, all of the regulations that come into that, right? And so you need to be able to get that person a little bit, more educated on the fact that, hey, we can take something that's a little more risky or a little less return that's quote unquote financially imprudent because, we're making the investment not to earn income and grow the endowment, but to move forward this charitable purpose. And so if you think of grants in purely financial terms, you're making an investment that's a guaranteed 100% loss, right? And so anything you move away from a guaranteed 100% loss is more prudent from a financial standpoint. And so, whenever you break down those silos and bring the two people together and they can start thinking creatively, they can bring their financial acumen with the programmatic prowess. And you merge those two sides of the house together, you can start like really unleashing more. And the merger of the houses and the importance of the capacity is crucial. And that's an area where, Venn Foundation kind of prides ourselves in stepping in because we can be the outsourcing partner for the complexity and for the compliance. And so, especially, smaller nonprofits, even larger nonprofits that don't want to do the expenditure responsibility or negotiate the loan or deal with the legal compliance piece, they can work with Venn in order to allow us to take on the burdens and the barriers to PRIs, and they can focus on the strategy and the impact.
Thank you for that. And you and I have talked many times, but in hearing you talk about that and bringing up and referencing that report, you hit on something that I hadn't thought about before when it comes to PRIs. They are, the name investment is in them. And I've come from a background of helping venture capital fund managers and real estate fund managers, and they have entire diligence teams that do nothing that source and vet opportunities and be it sounds like foundations don't necessarily have that kind of capacity. They might have an investment manager that's managing investments, but they don't have like a diligence team that's scoping and vetting PRI opportunities, right? And so you helped illustrate for me at least, and I hope maybe this makes sense for our audience and our viewers that these silos really do create these barriers, and that's why here comes Venn, and that tees up my next question beautifully, and you alluded to it a little bit, but Venn exists to really, you know, put everybody in a bigger silo. So talk a little bit more, talk more about what Venn can do, and then I'd love it if you'd take us through the Saddleback project that you work on, because I think that's a really great example, very tangible, very real life. I think many of us can relate to this idea of an iconic, anchoring community anchor needing capital, and how does that work and happen? So tell us more about Venn and then give us a specific example of Saddleback.
Sure. Yeah, and so I want to correct the record a little bit and be kind to
Sure.
my colleagues in philanthropy. I do think that there is a lot of diligence that happens
That's fair.
inside of
Yes, thank
philanthropy,
you.
especially on the programmatic side, right?
Yeah.
And I think that drives home the point that you have programmatic officers who know their stuff, right?
Yes.
They know about the needs of housing. They're releasing really tremendous reports. They know about healthcare metrics and climate issues. A lot of people in foundations, community foundations, have PhDs or advanced degrees in the area that they're doing. Right? They're just as qualified as the people on those diligence teams in a venture capital fund. Right? And they're there to figure out what is the best solution that we can put grant money into in order to drive impact. And so the issue is less that the internal capacity around finding the right doers and investing in them, but marrying kind of the tool that you're using to make it happen, right? Because if you have a nonprofit that's kind of cash intensive, service oriented, you're always going to need to grant money to them. And a lot of this stuff is just like tremendous work downstream. We're fixing the problems, but upstream you have systems and barriers and issues that are causing all of these things to happen. And a lot of times that can be sort of supply chains within businesses, or it can be just how we're employing people, how we're educating them, how we're all of these issues that lead to many of the downstream problems that we're facing. Kind of have upstream solutions that can be invested in, whether in the for-profit or nonprofit space, that result in kind of revenue or cost savings, and being able to leverage the expertise of those programmatic officers and bring in the tools and the market discipline of the investment houses where the PRIs really shine. And so I would just push back a little bit and say that they definitely have that capacity. They just need to talk to each other
That's right.
a
But
little bit
thank you
more.
for helping me reframe that. You're right. They are both very good at what they do. I think the breakdown is how do they join forces, right?
Yeah. And so the next question, and I'll throw up a slide here too. Again, testing my ability by doing it multiple times.
You're one for one here. Let's see if you can make it two for two.
Yeah. Um, where is this at?
while you're looking for that, Kris, as it's so Venn exists literally, in that middle to help break down those barriers, navigate the complexities, do the diligence, do the reporting, help with the compliance. I think that's Venn's Venn kind of exists in the middle to help kind of bring those disciplines together and get everyone comfortable. I think Kris, you talked about it earlier. It's the complexity piece, and making compliance is huge. And that's, again, if there's a capacity issue and you don't have that in-house expertise, you can turn to Venn to be able to provide that, which I think is really unique. And what's exciting about the work that you do, you literally exist to break down those barriers. And that's why I immediately thought of you as my first guest for this series because of what you do. So take it away.
Yeah, so how to access PRIs. So we like to use this slide because being able to provide a PRI, and the definition of PRI is primary purposes for charitable impact, no significant purposes for production of income or appreciation of property, and there are some prohibited uses around lobbying and things like that. And so if the beauty of it and the ability of philanthropic capital to make these investments is, like you said, they've already received a tax donation, a tax deduction. They're sitting there, they're growing in a tax advantaged way. And so they should be kind of subsidizing some of this risk that, just doers are just, assuming internally for the good of the cause. And so, individuals can't do PRIs in a tax advantaged way. You can always lend money. Friends and family is a great example of that. You can always just lend money to an organization and, hope and a prayer and all of that. But if you want to get the tax deduction for doing so, you can't do it directly. Businesses similarly can invest in their community, but there's no direct avenue for the tax deduction. Private foundations and donor advised funds can do them, but as we mentioned, there's the complexity barriers that are perceived, whether perceived or real, around the reporting and just the governance of them. And so the solution that Venn came up with is that we're actually structured as a 501(c)(3) public charity. We are a DAF sponsoring organization, and so when any of these individuals can open up a DAF with us, so an individual can open up a DAF, a business can open up a DAF, a private foundation can open up a DAF, and if you're a public charity, whether you already have a DAF or you're just operating as a charity, you can open up a DAF yourself. And so once the individuals am I on the right slide? Uh, once the here we go. There we go. Once the individuals create their accounts, then we can syndicate all of those together and make the PRI. So public charities, like we said, can do them if they can do PRIs if they take on the expenditure responsibility and the governance of them. And so then, as a public charity, does all of that, and all of these potential PRI makers have to do is simply make a grant to us. So we make PRIs as simple as making a grant. You make a grant into a new donor advised fund. Then from your donor advised fund, you select and you advise us. You recommend the recipient of the PRI. And so we can take an individual into a single PRI or multiple PRIs, which is great because if you have several smaller organizations, you can open up a Venn account with as little as $1,000, and if you bring that in with 100 other people, now you have $100,000 investment in a social enterprise that may have otherwise been very difficult to do, and you don't have to worry about any of the reporting. And so to date, we've worked with 98 individuals, 11 businesses, 25 foundations, and 22 charities, 156 accounts, 39 million contributed, and 40 million deployed, which we always like that number because we've deployed more money than we've received because the money has the ability to be recycled and deployed again. It has the ability to earn interest, which gets deployed.
That's awesome. That was a super helpful explanation, and I appreciate the visuals, and it really showed how you come together in the middle to make this all possible. And for the entity receiving the PRI, it simplifies and streamlines as well because you have one entity then that you're dealing with. So it's really a win-win on both sides. Knowing that, talk to us now about Saddleback and this really unique project that came together using a PRI and Venn Foundation to really save something that was integral to this community.
Yeah, and am I still sharing, or is that
Yep, you're still sharing.
I didn't, yeah, any idea how to stop that? So,
Okay.
yeah, usually it's easier to stop sharing. I don't know. If you have the ability to kick me out from sharing, feel free. Um, Otherwise, I will maybe just share something else.
Yeah, pull up Saddleback. It's a great story, especially for those skiers on the call. Um,
Yeah, so I think you're seeing Saddleback now,
yep,
right?
we're seeing Saddleback.
So we have to share, at least it's relevant.
That's right.
Um, so the thing that the ability to use, sorry, my computer is all over the place now. But the ability to use philanthropic capital to uh, infuse money into economic development, prevention of community deterioration, those are IRS defined uh, charitable purposes. And so whenever you're looking at taking philanthropic capital in an example like Saddleback, this was an economic driver for the region. It was and here it says a beloved ski resort, and I'll put this in the chat too, so you can. I wasn't planning on just sharing it, but um, and for many reasons, the company was going um, out of business, and so it needed to be saved. And I wasn't around to do the deal structuring for this one, but my understanding was that there were certain tax credits and economic developments that opportunities that the state was going to try to provide that fell through in order to kind of subsidize other investors to come in. And so, then structured a program-related investment with Saddleback. We actually have three different investments with them. That was a subordinated and forgivable loan, forgivable if certain impact metrics were met, and then repayable for some of the other aspects of the operations that actually generated the revenue and made it sustainable. And so this one was very creative in that ability to say, hey, if we can provide worker housing, or if we can provide ski lessons for children, if we can provide some of these charitable aspects of the operations that are just sort of lost leaders, then we can create some forgivable aspects of this investment built in once those thresholds are met. And the rest of the part that just sort of operates as a normal ski resort would we'll give you, 6 year, 5% simple interest, 1% that's paid annually, 4% that's accrued, so really favorable terms just to get this company, back up and running. And, since then it has reopened on this website. Seems like it is a little dated, but so they did reopen. They are in operation. If you ever find yourself in rural Maine, you can ski there and actually take advantage of this site. But um, the relevance and the frequency of economic development and prevention of economic deterioration, I think, is it comes up over and over again because I figured out how to stop sharing. Because you have some of these like blighted areas or overlooked areas. You have, post coming out of the pandemic, you have regions that just lost their economic prowess. And it might take a long time for them to build back. Or maybe you have an organization, one area that I particularly love when it comes to PRIs is sort of employee or ownership exits, right? So you have, a generation of owners who have built these great community anchors. And these are the ones that, they're not, trading, publicly, and they're not, earning, billions of dollars, but they are the ones who are sponsoring the Little League teams. You see them kind of in the outfield for the local, for the local games. You see them kind of in the Rotary and Lions Club and on all these things that really drive kind of the essence of these like local communities. And the absence of them kind of is really detrimental to the community at large, right? So being being able to balance that tension of we have a retiring owner with a need to keep this business local and thriving and part of the community, philanthropic capital, whether through community organizations and foundations or place-based foundations, just make the most sense to say, hey, let's give the capital that we need to put this on a more sustainable track, because if we lose this thing, it will have, cascading effects on employment and on social service needs and on, all of these ancillary benefits of these community institutions.
Kris, you've done a really great job walking us through, in-depth description of PRIs and how they can be deployed. For someone on this call that is considering, trying to infuse a PRI into their capital stack, where would you tell them to start? What should their first step be? How would they approach a foundation? There's so many things. If you could give them, let's call it two pieces of advice, what would you say?
Well, I think the first piece of advice would be to call Venn
All right,
and
I was just gonna say, we'll just call that. They'll help you out.
call Vin, and we love being a partner with people. So we have two pillars to our foundation, to our mission. We're a nonprofit ourselves. The first pillar is field building, so doing conversations like these with larger groups, as well as just really brainstorming about how to use these tools on an individual level. And so we will spend, hours with a social enterprise that we believe in to help them think through the strategies. We'll even join them in calls to pitch the how. The social enterprises are very aware of the what and the why. But how do you get PRIs to flow through? That's where we come in. If we can ever be of assistance in doing that, put that under a field building hat. And then the syndication that I already talked about is sort of our other mission. So the field building is entirely complimentary, so never never be shy about reaching out to us. We're happy to be a sounding board. Apart from that, the next primary question is it charitable? And so the first thing that you have to do in qualifying a PRI is to justify its charitability. And so the IRS has rules and regulations, statutes, written determinations, all sorts of very fun to read materials about whether something is charitable. It's very similar to what nonprofits have to do in order to justify themselves under the organization and operation tests for PRIs. The purpose of the investment has to be charitable, even if the recipient themselves is not, a 501(c)(3) public charity. And so that can create kind of a nuance. And that's where, that's the part of my job that I really love, just kind of thinking creatively around that. So if you're doing something and you think it's charitable and you really believe it's charitable, reach out to us. We'll be able to sniff out if you're just trying to get charitable capital because it's cheaper. But if you believe in your mission and you think, hey, I'm really doing this and I'm subsidizing this with my blood, sweat, and tears because I believe in it, and I'm just losing a bunch of money, but the cause is so great that I want to do this, and I don't want to go to conventional capital because they're going to tell me to use my tech to do something else, then you probably have some sort of charitable mission. It's just a matter of figuring out, how to define it and what it is. So, determining if it's charitable is the first question. We're always happy to help with that. But I think from the standpoint of the social enterprise, understanding what your mission is, what you're guiding, what your North Star is, and if you are bought into that, then usually a PRI is available. And then once you have that charitable mission, whether it's economic development, community deterioration pieces, like I said, place-based funders are usually the best ones to do that. In my mind, right, if you promote economic development in the place that a community foundation is sitting, then the people that are benefiting from the economic development will donate to the community foundation, and they'll have more money to kind of keep the system going. If you have an organization, that's thematic based. Like there are a lot of different private foundations. You can go actually any private foundation, you can look up who they give money to by just typing in private foundation 990. You can see a list of their grantees. You can see what their mission is. You can see if they do PRIs because those are recorded on their 990. And then figuring out who aligns kind of with that mission set. So if you're looking at supporting refugees or local media, or if you're doing, Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, right? Like if you're working on that issue, there are education-based foundations. And so being able to marry the foundation's mission with yours. And again, that's something that Venn Foundation can work as a partner with to help kind of frame that. And then outside of private foundations, high net worth individuals who may be investing in you in any way, or maybe interested in investing, but after you get, kind of over the valley of death, you have enough funds to be fundable, but you don't have them yet. So how do you get the funds? And so those people may also have donor advised funds or have private foundations. So they're already bought into the what and the why that you're doing with it. And so if what you're doing is qualifiable as a PRI, add a slide into the deck that says, hey, here's kind of the for-profit piece. And maybe you still do that because ideally you'd like to get just kind of bankable conventional capital, but when you need to pivot, you can pivot. And if you're just going straight to a private foundation, maybe you start there. And then the last piece would just be kind of understanding that those silos do exist. So if you're going to a foundation, trying to get both of the people in the room, both someone programmatically and someone from the investment side, so that they're talking together. Because if you go to a program officer hasn't done PRIs yet, they're not necessarily going to understand the ins and outs of it. If you only go to the investment side, they're going to give you their long list of diligence and financial metrics and all of that. And so you need to be able to bring the sides together. And again, that's a conversation Ben has had many, many times. And so if we can be of assistance in that, once we've qualified something as a PRI, then we can be a partner and a sounding board for making those calls and conversations.
Great. And I can attest personally for our organization, Kris is always willing to jump on the phone with us, work things through, talk about things. And that's ultimately his graciousness and openness. Again, put Kris, you on the top of my list for this conversation. We are almost at 2 o'clock. I will open it up for one question. If anybody has a question, drop it in the chat. We will be turning this into a YouTube video, so bloopers and all. It's meant to be live, but we'll put the recording into YouTube so it can be accessed. We'll be sharing out some of the links and reports that Kris referenced. But if anyone has a question for Kris while we have him, before we hit the top of the hour, please drop it in the chat. This has been a really great and informative conversation, Kris. Every time I talk to you, I learn something. I am confident that our audience feels the same way. And I don't see any questions yet. It's almost 2 o'clock. So I'm gonna go ahead and say thank you so much for being our first guest, a great guest. Thank you to everyone who joined in this afternoon. And stay tuned. We're gonna be doing these once a month on the third Thursday. We might have to have Kris back because there was so much to talk about here. We took the full hour. But everyone have a great day, and remember that there are real people solving real problems out there in the world, and together we can get so much done. Thanks a lot, everybody. Kris, my deep thanks to you, and we'll talk soon.